Hey everybody, this is Brian for another solo episode of Curiosity Continuum, starring me, Brian, because I'm not Josh. Solo episodes are designed for Josh and I to share our thoughts individually on a topic that may be top of mind for us, things that we would like to bounce off of you just one-on-one. Sometimes we'll riff on one another after we listen to what the other person has said in a statement prior. But regardless, thank you for joining me today for this special edition of Curiosity Continuum. The topic I'd like to talk about during this solo episode is the perspective of distance. Distance can be measured by physical distance, meaning, miles or kilometers or inches or feet. And sometimes the distance is time. Sometimes it's measured in days, months, and years. Sometimes it's measured in an emotional quotient, meaning like you become closer or you become further away from somebody. You always can get perspective at a distance. You don't have the same perspective. You don't have the same visceral type of things going on because you now have a chance to look back and assess circumspectly what's going on. Sometimes those things are forced upon us. Sometimes they're by our choice. But we always can learn something by walking around a situation or a relationship and take a moment and assess what's going on. I find it really interesting that as people get older and they have much life to look back on, good, bad, and otherwise, they have a perspective about how they make it something that they can learn from and do differently, or they may take it and encourage somebody else to do something different because they now have the perspective of distance. One of the things that pops into my mind as people have gotten older are the risks they wish they would have taken at an earlier age. Now, even for people who have reinvented themselves later in life, I have heard a very consistent thing, especially among men, where they're saying, I wish I would have tried this or done this years before. Now, obviously, they're aware they're at, and they can only start from there. I once was in a group where there was transitioning people from one job to the next. And I say men in the previous comment because this specific gathering was for men only going through a transition. At that point, I was in my mid-30s. And these men that were sitting around the table were in their early to mid 50s, about 20 years ahead of me. You should have seen some of the looks on their faces as they're trying to kind of gussy themselves up again, to put themselves out there because they had been too senior in an organization and they got cut. Ageism is a real thing that can happen in the workplace. Even though there's many regulations and things, your age, which sometimes also ties to your salary and your benefit expectations and different things, all roll together. And to have to reinvent yourself at that time can be very demoralizing for any professional, any person, where all of a sudden you're not as valuable as you once were, or at least perceive that. I want to invite you to consider that your value is not hinged on the fact that you have a job or you have certain relationships. And I'm speaking to myself here because it's very easy to start to assign value based on certain criteria that you've laid in. But I firmly believe that value, your worth, is immutable because it's not human beings that give it to you. And they can reinforce it, they can try to tear it down. But you have the opportunity to take it and say, okay, what am I going to do with that? And sometimes you realize that you've taken it too deep inside in terms of like you gave it emotional space that didn't have any right being there in the first place. And it may have made you bitter. It may have made you choose differently, maybe out of spite. Sometimes you realize, boy, that was the best decision I ever made. If, it was a relationship and you go, man, that person was crazy. And I'm glad I avoided that. But you wouldn't have known it at the time. And part of the thing that happens is that, we can help judge that. But, part of the perspective of distance also is talking to somebody else who's not you. Allow myself to talk to myself. Exactly what I'm doing on this episode. But people around you who you trust, because not everybody is a safe place. And not everybody who's a safe place in one way is the same way for another topic. But in those topics where you can find them, Their distance is that they are not in the first person in your situation. Who can you ask that's at a distance that can speak to your situation? Who may be older than you that you can go to them and ask them the perspective of time and experience. What would you have me consider? And I would invite you to also consider whose words are big in your ears. I know that I have a list, and if you're on that list, you know it. Because you know when you speak, I trust you, I respect you, I love you, and I value what you have to say because I know that I cannot see it all myself. I hope that you all have somebody in your life that can give you the perspective from their space. And I hope that as you have gotten perspective on your own space, as you get distance from it, that you would see somebody to the side of you, beside you, that may be in a different phase, that you would be able to encourage them by giving your perspective on their situation from a distance. Until next time, this is Brian for Curiosity Continuum.